nursery was empty. The hallway was empty. The kitchen was empty. The entire Cross family estate sank into a kind of silence that Declan Cross knew all too well, a chilling silence that only descended when a catastrophe had struck. His hand reflexively grabbed the Beretta from the nightstand drawer before he could even think, the cold-blooded reflex of a man who had lived in the shadows for far too long. He frantically checked the security cameras, yet there was no sign of a break-in, and the alarm system was still armed and running smoothly. This was certainly not an enemy from the outside, but Leo, his 8-month-old son, was not in his crib. The nanny was not answering her phone, and even the maid Clara Hayes, the lowly, invisible woman who had never dared to speak more than 10 words to him in a single day, had completely vanished. Declan Cross controlled half of the Chicago underworld with weapons, smuggling routes, real estate, and a massive chain of money-laundering restaurants, holding everything neatly in the palm of his hand. Yet in this very moment, the most ruthless boss in the Midwest could not control a single thing. His heart beat erratically, not the pulse of a wild beast preparing to tear its enemy apart, but the heartbeat of a man about to lose the only life that still held meaning. Then suddenly, he saw a faint streak of light casting out from the back garden. Declan stepped outside, walking barefoot on the freezing gravel with his gun firmly in hand, as the biting wind from Lake Michigan cut across his broad shoulders, and what he saw made him stop completely, unable to move a muscle. On the stone bench near the south wall, bathed in the pale yellow light spilling from the laundry room vent, Clara Hayes, his maid, had fallen asleep. She was still wearing her janitorial uniform, her back resting against the cold stone, her head tilted back, and buried deep within her arms was Leo, his son. The baby was bundled tightly in a frayed blue blanket, a shabby blanket that did not belong in this luxurious home, nor among any of the expensive things Declan had ever purchased. The yellow rubber gloves remained on Clara's hands. Those hands that had scrubbed floors, scoured sinks, and polished every stair tread were now locked tightly around the baby against her chest. One hand supported his back, the other shielded his chest, as if holding back the piercing cold, as if protecting him from the cruelty of this entire world. Neither of them stirred. Declan stood frozen. The Beretta in his hand suddenly became heavy and meaningless. And in that overwhelming second, the notorious boss seemingly could not breathe. Declan's astonishment eventually passed, giving way to tens of thousands of questions screaming in his mind. He gently lifted his foot to step forward, but the crunching sound of gravel under his bare soles tore through the silent night. That sound made Clara jolt awake. Her eyes opened wide, clouded from sleep deprivation and the freezing cold, but the moment her gaze focused on the towering figure of the man holding a gun before her, she instantly tightened her embrace. It was not the fear of a hired hand terrified of her employer's punishment, but the absolute terror of someone protecting her only treasure, afraid it would be snatched away. The baby against her chest stirred slightly but remained fast asleep, his breathing steady and worn, standing in stark contrast to the violent trembling of the woman's frail body. Declan looked at those panicked eyes, looked at the torn yellow rubber gloves cradling his own flesh and blood, and for the first time in many years, he felt that the dark power he wielded held absolutely no meaning. His voice rose, hoarse and fractured, shattering the frozen atmosphere of the dark night with just 3 words that carried a command, yet also contained an unprecedented surrender: bring him inside. Clara clumsily stood up, her legs numb from the bone-chilling cold, carefully hugging Leo tight as she walked past the most powerful man in the city. When she disappeared from sight, Declan slowly lowered his hand, placing the gun that had stolen countless lives onto the cold stone step, leaving it behind in the garden because tonight, he had no need for this lifeless weapon. A few minutes later, in the quiet space of the lavish kitchen bathed in warm yellow light, 2 people from 2 completely opposing worlds, the notorious boss and the lowly maid, sat facing each other across the massive marble table, beginning a conversation that would forever alter the trajectory of their lives. To understand why a powerful man who always breathed fire could stand paralyzed with freezing bare feet in a gravel-filled garden, merely to watch a maid embrace his infant son without daring to call out, one must turn back the wheel of time to where all this coldness began. The Cross family estate, located in the desolate suburbs of Chicago, was built entirely of solid gray stone blocks reaching high into the night sky. looking more like a fortress meant to imprison souls than a family home. Dozens of security cameras operated ceaselessly, covering every invisible blind spot, while towering guards carrying rifles patrolled continuously 24 hours a day, alongside a towering electric fence surrounding the entire estate of nearly 2 acres. From the outside, the curious only saw a regal wealth that reeked of money, but from the inside, Declan Cross's deep eyes saw only one thing: absolute safety, and to him, safety was the only thing in this world worth buying with money. This year, Declan was 38 years old, having used his sin-stained hands to control the largest weapons smuggling ring in the region, seizing all underworld power through ruthless tactics and a mind so ice-cold that no one under his command dared speak his real name, but merely bowed their heads and called him boss. Yet that absolute power and colossal fortune were built upon a blood-soaked afternoon when the darkness truly opened its mouth to swallow his life, back when the teenage Declan had just turned 16. At that time, he stood frozen on the cracked pavement, witnessing with his own eyes his proud father collapse right before the tips of his shoes. 3 deafening gunshots rang out, 2 burying straight into his chest and 1 piercing his head, as blood drenched an entire expanse of the brick courtyard. The cold-blooded shooter did not target his father out of personal vendetta, but rather they targeted him because they knew he loved his wife more than his own life, and that was the sole vulnerability, the fatal Achilles heel in a mob boss's steel armor. Before taking his final breath in a pool of blood, his father only had time to raise a trembling hand to grasp his shirt and teach him exactly one single sentence, hissed through clenched teeth, that he must absolutely never let anyone know what he cares about, because the thing he loved would be the very bullet that ends him. Those blood-soaked dying words had etched themselves deep into Declan's cerebral cortex, and he had lived like a soulless machine by those very words for the past 22 years. He did a very good job of not loving, not getting close, not dispensing affection, and not allowing anyone to step deeply enough into his heart to turn into a fatal weakness that could threaten his throne, until the fragile life named Leo was born, a child who had never been part of his perfect plan, but was merely the unintended result of a fleeting, tasteless affair with a frivolous woman of high society. A mere 2 short weeks after giving birth, that heartless woman had abandoned the wailing newborn in the crib, leaving behind a crumpled piece of paper tossed on the kitchen counter with cold words stating she was not born to be a mother, before packing her suitcase and disappearing forever from his world. Declan stood in silence, staring at the unfeeling note, then bent down to look at the baby sinking into a labored sleep, and he decided to do the only thing he knew how to do, which was to build even more solid walls to imprison his emotions. That he threw money at hiring Sarah, a professional nanny with first-class credentials and extensive experience, working under a cold, lucid contract that detailed every minor aspect. He established an on-call medical team for care, installed a series of expensive infrared cameras right in the nursery, and even equipped it with the world's most advanced breathing sensor system. Everything concerning his only flesh and blood was protected and strictly controlled by thick stacks of dollar bills and state-of-the-art technology, yet he himself rarely lowered himself to hold his son to his chest. Every night, coming home late when the entire estate had sunk into sleep, draped in a coat heavily scented with the metallic stench of blood and gunpowder, he would only take heavy steps past the nursery, stopping by the silently closed oak door to listen to the tiny, rhythmic breath slipping through the crack before coldly walking away. He acted like a soldier on patrol, cautiously checking the security system every night, rather than a father warming a bond with his own biological son. He loved Leo with all his life, yet he loved his son in the only twisted way he knew, which was to keep a cold, 1,000-mile distance to ensure the boy remained absolutely safe. Because in Declan's barren and heavily guarded mind, if this underworld filled with wolves knew he had a child he was willing to die for, that innocent, naive baby would instantly become the target to endure the enemy's next bullet. Right beneath that same cold marble roof, exactly 3 flights of stairs away from the luxurious nursery, lived a completely invisible woman whom no one bothered to look at. 6 months ago, Clara Hayes had stepped through the back door of the Cross estate, carrying a shabby, small cloth suitcase just big enough to stuff in 2 faded outfits, a pair of worn-out shoes, and a carefully folded, old blue blanket lying quietly at the very bottom of the back. Her hands were calloused, her fingernails cut short and bleeding from cracking due to soaking in harsh cleaning chemicals for far too long. Her eyes carried the gloom of someone accustomed to walking into any room without a single person bothering to look up. Her background was nearly entirely blank, with no assets, no family, and no connections to the outside world. The butler and head of security, Garrett Flynn, had hired her from a cheap labor agency without bothering to thoroughly vet her, because in this bullet-riddled underworld, no one had the free time to investigate the background of a woman who merely scrubbed toilets and mopped floors. Clara's duty was to fade into the shadows of the fortress. She mopped the vast marble hallways, polished every section of the oak stair railings, laundered the expensive silk bedsheets, and scrubbed the kitchen until the stainless steel reflected her own pale, exhausted, hollow face. She did everything in absolute silence. When lunchtime arrived, she would quietly take her meal and huddle in the corner of the laundry room, curling up on a rotting wooden chair right next to the giant dryer, because the sweltering heat radiating from that groaning machine was the only warmth she was allowed to touch in this suffocating house. None of the other servants wanted to speak to her, and she never uttered a word of complaint or demanded a single thing. But the strangest thing about Clara was the torn yellow rubber gloves that she never removed from her swollen hands. She wore them throughout the long, agonizing days, even when she was not working, even when she sat chewing on a piece of dry bread during her lunch break, or when she sat staring blankly into the dark by herself. Those gloves were like a layer of armor, an absolute isolating membrane keeping her bare hands from ever directly touching this cruel world again. Because deep within the shattered mind of that 25-year-old woman, every time her bare skin touched anything, she would remember the sensation of a tiny hand desperately gripping her finger, before slowly going limp and turning ice cold. However, no matter how perfect a shell she had created for herself, every time she walked past the nursery on the second floor with a mop in hand, her heavy footsteps would instinctively slow down. Late on many nights, when the entire estate was engulfed in darkness and the nanny Sarah had turned off her phone to fall into a deep sleep after finishing her strictly timed shift, Clara would stand quietly out in the hallway, listening to baby Leo's piercing cries. With no one stepping forward to comfort him, the maid would cross all class boundaries, tiptoeing to turn the doorknob and slipping into the quiet room like a ghost, gently lifting the wailing newborn against her frail chest and softly rocking him. She did not know how to sing cheerful nursery rhymes, so she merely whispered and hummed the sorrowful hymn from the distant mountain forests where she once belonged. Miraculously, the moment the warmth from her chest transferred to him, Leo would instantly stop crying, burying his tear-streaked face into the hollow of her neck, and his tiny fingers would grip tightly onto the rough fabric of her janitorial uniform. Clara would just stand there, cradling the boss's flesh and blood, rocking him until the boy's breathing was completely peaceful, before carefully placing him back into the expensive crib, stepping backward, and pulling the doors shut as if she had never existed there. At exactly 10:30 that night, while Declan was still immersed in a smell of gunpowder at the warehouse docks, the Marble Estate's central heating system abruptly stopped working. There was no loud explosion or piercing alarm, only a silent error message illuminating the phone screen of the butler and head of security, Garrett Flynn. Standing in the quiet hallway, Garrett hesitated for a beat before deciding to dial the only person he always served, Declan Cross, the boss's biological younger sister. On the other end of the line, inside a lavish penthouse awash in the shimmering lights of Chicago, Vivian was leisurely swirling expensive red wine in her glass, her cold eyes skimming over money laundering financial reports. When Garrett haltingly reported that the heating system had failed and the nursery on the second floor was taking the full brunt of the freezing gusts from Lake Michigan battering the glass windows, Vivian merely smirked, releasing words as sharp as razor blades. She ordered Garrett not to call a repairman tonight, and absolutely not to bother her brother over such trivial matters. The aunt's indifferent voice echoed clearly over the speakerphone, stating that the baby already had a nanny and a whole team of highly paid servants to care for him, so he would not freeze to death just from one night without a heater. Garrett hung up, obediently followed her orders, and crawled into his warm blankets, knowing full well that all his dark secrets rested in Vivian's hands. At that very moment, in the staff quarters, Nanny Sarah Jenkins had finished her shift at 10 o'clock, obediently placed Leo in his crib, switched her phone to silent, and drifted into a deep sleep. In the flawless contract Sarah had signed, there was no clause requiring her to sacrifice her sleep to wake up and soothe the child crying from the cold. As time ticked away, the nursery rapidly transformed into an icebox. The marble walls swallowed up whatever meager lingering warmth remained. The 8-month-old child began to writhe, his tiny hands curling up as he desperately sought warmth, but it was hopeless. Leo began to cry, the sound initially just weak, choked noises calling for an adult, which then slowly tore through the night, morphing into the desperate wails of a fragile life fading from the freezing cold. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then 20 minutes passed, and no one appeared. Down on the ground floor, in the dark kitchen, only one person was listening. Clara Hayes stopped scrubbing the toilet when those broken sobs transmitted through the old walkie-talkie mounted on the wall. Her eyes were glued to the wall clock, which now struck 11 at night. She waited, hoping to hear the footsteps of the nanny or the butler, but the only answer was a terrifying silence surrounding the baby's increasingly hoarse cries. Unable to hesitate for a single second longer, Clara tossed the cleaning rag aside, kept the yellow rubber gloves on her hands, and bolted out of the kitchen. Shattering every harsh rule regarding the status of a lowly worker, she sprinted madly up to the second floor, throwing open the door to the nursery, which was now as freezing as a giant freezer. Seeing Leo shivering in his expensive crib, his face flushed from the cold and his lips turning purple, Clara did not think twice before lunging forward to scoop the boy up, clutching him tightly to her frail chest. The very moment her fragile warmth transferred to Leo, he instantly stopped crying, his tiny hands frantically gripping her uniform shirt like clinging to the only life preserver amidst an icy ocean. Realizing that the entire estate had now become an ice coffin, Clara scrambled downstairs to her shabby room, pulling out the frayed blue blanket from the bottom of her suitcase to wrap securely around Leo. She knew there was only one place left with a bit of scrap warmth, which was the exhaust vent from the giant dryer blowing out into the back garden. Clutching the fragile life to her chest, the brave little woman stepped out into the night, facing the piercing, biting snow winds of the Chicago winter, curling herself up on the cold stone bench, using her own body as a wind shield for the boss's son, returning to the present. In the quiet space of the lavish kitchen bathed in warm yellow light, two people from two completely opposing worlds, the notorious boss and the lowly maid, sat facing each other across the massive marble table. For the first time in her life, Clara was allowed to sit in a chair meant only for the powerful guests of the Cross family. She carefully placed Leo into the portable bassinet beside her, her hands still wearing the yellow rubber gloves, gently stroking the frayed blue blanket warming the tiny life. The boy stirred slightly but did not wake, his bunched-up fingers still gripping a corner of her uniform hem, as if terrified this woman would disappear. Declan sat opposite her, silently observing her every movement. He saw the slight trembling in her rough hands, saw her tired eyes overflowing with a tenderness reserved for his son, a pure light he had never seen in anyone within his blood-soaked underworld. Curiosity, intertwined with a suffocating feeling in his chest, made it impossible for him to remain silent any longer. He spoke in a low, slow voice, as if he himself did not understand why he was asking a question that crossed the boundaries of a master and an employee. "Who taught you how to hold a child like that?" The boss's voice rang out, shattering the thick silence of the room. Clara did not look up, her gaze still glued to Leo's sleeping face, but Declan could clearly see her frail silhouette suddenly stiffen. A heavy, seemingly endless silence enveloped the space. Her eyes gradually became distant, hollow, as if piercing through the cold marble walls of the estate to drift back to some traumatic memory he could not reach. The hands hidden within her rubber gloves softly clenched, her breathing turning fragile. Then her dry, cracked lips parted slightly, letting out two incredibly small words that carried the weight of a mountain, crushing all the pride of the powerful man sitting across from her Dud-and-Wise son. Those two words slipped from her mouth as light as a sigh, yet they slashed a sharp blade through the atmosphere. Declan was stunned. His entire body freezing, the hand resting on the marble table unconsciously clenching tight. The boss's usually sharp, cold eyes suddenly wavered intensely. For the first time since the woman with the shabby suitcase and calloused hands walked into his fortress 6 months ago, Declan realized he knew absolutely nothing about her. He did not know where she came from, did not know why she always stubbornly clung to those yellow rubber gloves, did not know why she cherished that torn, old blanket like a priceless treasure, and only now did he shockingly realize that the lowly woman who scrubbed toilets sitting before him carried within her the ultimate agony of a mother. The arrogance of a man holding the power of life and death in his hands instantly crumbled to dust before the bleeding words of the maid. Silence swallowed the massive kitchen, leaving only the sound of Leo's steady breathing in the bassinet. Declan did not rush her, he merely spoke softly in a voice even huskier than before, asking her to tell him. Clara blinked, her eyes dry without a single tear, for her tears had run completely dry 4 years ago. Her voice echoed steadily, chillingly calm, as if narrating the life of someone else rather than the fatal wound bleeding in her own heart. The boy was named Noah, 2 years old with bright curly hair and a radiant smile, who always loved to grip her collar tightly whenever he drifted to sleep. The mother and son had once lived in a dilapidated, torn-up trailer park standing bare at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, where summers were scorching hot and winters brought biting, freezing winds that howled through every cracked crevice in the walls. Life was so impoverished that she had to toil away at 2 jobs, washing dishes and cleaning, just to scrape together every spare penny to buy milk and diapers for her child. Then the harshest winter struck, bringing a bone-chilling cold that cut through flesh and skin. The rotting heating system in the trailer broke down, and she could not dig up the money to repair it. Noah began to cough, then spiked a blazing high fever. In her utter destitution, she could only afford the cheapest fever-reducing medicine at the grocery store, holding her child tightly against her chest, completely unaware that he had contracted acute pneumonia. That night, she bundled Noah in every flimsy layer of blankets and clothes she owned, continuously applying wet cloths to his burning forehead, and sang him to sleep with that familiar, sorrowful hymn. She had held her child through the entire agonizingly long night, kneeling down to beg God to trade everything she had, even her own life, just to pray for her son to wake up safely the next morning. But when the pale rays of dawn shone through the cracked glass window, the child in her arms had grown completely cold. Noah had left this world forever because she was too poor to even afford a single penny to call an ambulance. Reaching this part, Clara's voice suddenly hardened, as sharp and cold as steel forged through hellfire. She stared straight into the void, uttering the blood oath that had been carved deep into her marrow since that fateful morning, that if in this life she was ever allowed to hold a child to her chest again, she would absolutely never let go, even if she had to trade her own life for it. Declan sat in silence across from her, his chest feeling as if crushed by tens of thousands of boulders. His gaze shifted from the pale, resilient face of the woman to his son sleeping soundly and peacefully in the portable bassinet beside her, the tiny hand still clutching tightly onto the hem of her uniform. In that moment, all the ideals, all the walls of iron and steel he had erected over the past 22 years shattered. He realized that his late father had been wrong. Love is never a weakness, but rather love is the most extraordinary power that can hold back even death. It is the only thing in this world stronger than fear. The most brutal boss of the Chicago underworld slowly stood up, walked to the cabinet storing the estate's most luxurious items, and pulled out a thick, warm wool blanket. Without saying a single word, Declan stepped behind Clara, gently draping the blanket over her shoulders that were trembling from the cold and from her inner wounds, with an absolute reverence he had never bestowed upon anyone else. In the days following that terrifying night, the cold atmosphere inside the marble fortress seemed to undergo an invisible shift. Butler Garrett and the elite subordinates began to notice strange signs from their boss when Declan Cross abruptly canceled a series of blood-soaked negotiations to divide territory in the northern region, and abandoned lucrative weapons smuggling shipments anchored at the docks. Instead of locking himself in a study filled with cigar smoke or personally dealing with traitors, the boss chose to step back, standing submerged in the dark, hidden corners of the hallways, just to quietly observe the woman wearing yellow rubber gloves caring for his son. He saw how Clara carefully folded every tiny shirt for Leo, how she patiently picked up the toys the boy threw on the floor over and over again without uttering a single word of complaint. Every beautiful moment, every early developmental milestone of the child that he had carelessly missed due to his busy life of slaughter, was preserved perfectly in the sorrowful eyes of the lowly maid, until one morning, a cruel reality struck Declan, a fatal blow that crushed the last shred of pride left in a father. Out of habit, he stepped into the nursery as the dawn was just breaking, and decided to do something he rarely did, which was to lean down and lift Leo up to his chest. But instead of a radiant smile, the 8-month-old child immediately struggled violently, flailing his little arms, pushing hard against his chest, and screaming in sheer panic, as if being kidnapped by some strange giant of a man. Leo's gut-wrenching cries were like thousands of needles piercing Declan's heart, rendering the hands that once pulled triggers without a hint of tremor entirely clumsy and useless. At that exact moment, Clara walked through the door, carrying a basin of warm water to sponge-bathe the baby. The instant Leo saw the frail silhouette in the familiar janitorial uniform, the boy stopped his sobbing screams, reaching his 2 little hands out into the air toward her with a fierce longing to be sheltered. Clara's eyes looked at her boss in confusion, but the instinct of a mother who had lost a child conquered her class-based fear, making her rush forward with open arms to receive the baby. The moment he slipped into Clara's embrace, Leo buried his tear-stained face deep into the hollow of her neck, his tiny fingers curling up to grip tightly onto her collar, finding absolute peace. Declan stood rooted in the middle of the quiet room, his empty arms hanging limp in the air. Ultimate agony surged in the depths of his eyes as the most brutal boss of the underworld realized a bitter truth, that he had completely lost the sacred connection with his own flesh and blood, allowing a woman bearing countless emotional scars to become the only world his son entirely trusted. The sudden and bizarre change in Declan Cross completely failed to slip past the sharp, cold eyes of Vivian Cross, the younger sister carrying the family's cruel blood, who was also the mastermind, manipulating the entire legal business network and massive money laundering system of the Underworld Empire. Unlike the brutish men who only knew how to solve problems with gun barrels and fists, Vivian possessed a cold, calculating mind and sharp eyes that always scanned every corner of the estate, exactly like a venomous snake slithering in the dark, waiting to sink its fangs into its prey. She quickly realized that her brother had voluntarily confined himself inside the marble fortress for many agonizing days, continuously absent from crucial turf division negotiations with notorious gangs, merely to stand rooted in a hidden corner of the hallway peeking at a lowly maid cleaning and caring for the child. To a woman who worshipped hierarchy like Vivian, the existence of Clara Hayes was not merely an eyesore, but the seed of a hazard directly threatening the throne and the absolute order of power that the Cross family had traded countless lives to build. In this world of starving wolves, emotion was highly toxic poison, offering no place for soft-heartedness, and the fact that a prominent boss began to care for a ragged, destitute hired hand was the first sign of a disastrous collapse. Without hesitating for another second, Vivian immediately summoned the butler and head of security, Garrett Flynn, to her lavish top-floor penthouse, hurling a steely command at him, demanding he tear through every corner of the poor, remote, foggy mountains of West Virginia to unearth every trace of the origins and dirty past of the woman wearing those yellow rubber gloves. Vivian was far too cunning not to understand that the most brutally destructive weapon in this world was not a bullet to the forehead, but rather grasping the fatal weakness and blood-soaked past of an enemy to suffocate them from within. Yet the venomous snake did not stop at dispatching people to investigate her background. She also ruthlessly wove a highly sophisticated web of psychological attacks right inside the estate to drive Clara into a corner. Obeying the mistress, Garrett began to subtly sow seeds of malicious gossip, allowing the venom to scatter across the hallways, kitchens, and rest areas of the gardening and security staff. Disdainful, probing glances, sneering lips, and cruel, fabricated whispers started to envelop the small woman. The servants began to whisper among themselves that Clara was nursing a scheme to climb high by seducing the boss, that a lowly, nameless janitor harbored dirty ambitions of stepping up to replace the lady of the house by using despicable tactics to psychologically manipulate an 8-month-old child. Though no one dared to stand out and insult Clara directly to her face, those biting, razor-sharp sarcastic remarks were always purposefully spoken just loud enough to slip into her ears every time she carried her plastic bucket full of mop water past them. Already an invisible shadow bearing deep wounds and a profound guilt complex, Clara became even more panicked, shrinking back and curling deeper into her sharply thorned shell of isolation, biting her lip to endure every invisible stab racing to slash apart the fragile, torn scraps of peace she had just pieced together beside the warmth and innocent smile of the angelic child. Vivian's vicious plan swiftly shifted from whispers in the dark out into the light, via an extremely sinister move aimed directly at Clara's fragile self-esteem. Late one afternoon, as the faint rays of sunlight filtered through the massive glass windows of the Cross estate, Vivian deliberately hosted a lavish tea party right in the main drawing room, formally inviting two aristocratic wives of notorious real estate partners in Chicago high society. To deal a fatal psychological blow, the venomous Spider-Woman ruthlessly ordered butler Garrett to force Clara to personally carry up the solid silver tea tray to serve them, instead of letting the highly trained maids do the job. Trembling, Clara stepped up the marble stairs, her hands clad in yellow rubber gloves gripping the heavy tea tray tightly, keeping her face lowered as she entered a room drowning in expensive perfume and probing, disdainful stares. She carefully set down each bone china teacup on the transparent glass table, shrinking herself to be as small as possible amidst the boisterous, fake laughter. But the exact moment she was about to step back to retreat into the shadows, Nanny Sarah coincidentally carried baby Leo past the magnificent hallway. The 8-month-old child was irritable and crying miserably in the stiff arms of the professional nanny, but the second those innocent eyes caught the frail silhouette of Clara in her familiar janitorial uniform, the boy immediately struggled fiercely, reaching his tiny arms out into the air, screaming for her to hold him. Leo's heartbreaking cries seemed to awaken the fierce maternal instinct once buried beneath ashes of mourning, causing Clara to completely forget all strict class rules, forgetting even the presence of the bullet-like glares aimed at her. She hastily set the tea tray down on the table, stepping forward to take the baby from Sarah's hands, hugging him tightly to her scrawny chest. Like a miracle, Leo instantly stopped crying, burying his tear-soaked face into the hollow of her neck, his tiny fingers curling to grip tightly onto her janitorial collar, finding absolute peace that a suffocating silence suddenly engulfed the drawing room before Vivian leisurely took a sip of tea, offered a bland smile, and unleashed razor-sharp blades coated in venom. Tilting her head slightly toward the two high society wives, she dropped a cruel, sarcastic remark in a voice that was soothing yet chilled to the bone. She pointed out that, look here, this is the exact problem when lowly cleaning staff, not knowing their proper place, go around forging a disgusting habit of reliance in the air of the family. The humiliating words rang out loud and clear, exposing the indelible class divide, stripping bare Clara's lowly status before the sneering pouts and stares filled with pity mixed with disgust from the wealthy woman. Every word, every sentence Vivian spoke pierced through Clara's feeble shell, burying straight into her patched-up heart, causing her entire body to freeze, her breath choking in her chest. Any illusions of a tiny bit of fragile warmth just kindled were instantly shattered, turning into shards of glass slashing at her soul. The hands holding Leo suddenly became trembling, powerless before the brutal reality that she was forever destined to be a dirty shadow with no right to touch the light. Enduring the humiliating shame gnawing at her soul, Clara bit her lip until it almost bled, slowly placing the screaming baby back into the nanny's arms, not daring to look any further into the desperate eyes of the boss's son. She bowed her body deeply, turning her back and taking stumbling steps to flee the suffocating drawing room, leaving behind Leo's gut-wrenching wails. Only to once again shrink back, curling herself into her invisible, dark, and cold snail shell, bearing a heart that bled unceasingly. A few nights after that tear-soaked and humiliating tea party, darkness once again surrounded the marble estate, carrying a catastrophe that crashed down right upon the notorious boss's head. The quiet midnight air was torn apart by the sound of thundering footsteps down the hallway and the panicked screams of Nanny Sarah from the nursery on the second floor. The 8-month-old child had suddenly spiked a malignant high fever, his entire body burning as hot as a red-hot coal in a forge, while his lips and tiny fingertips began turning a terrifying shade of purple. Leo's breathing became rapid, shallow, and rasped with laborious wheezes, his little chest convulsing violently as if desperately fighting to seize a sliver of thin air. This horrifying symptom perfectly mirrored the cruel replay of the fateful night that had stolen baby Noah's life in the desolate mountains years ago. The entire underground fortress descended into utter chaos as Declan rushed into the room with a pale face, ordering someone to call Dr. Arthur immediately. In just 15 minutes, the dedicated family doctor and his medical team arrived carrying an array of advanced emergency equipment, transforming the luxurious nursery into an intensive care unit flooded with cold, blinding white light and the piercing beeps of the heart monitor. The highest doses of fever-reducing drugs were injected into the tiny body, An oxygen mask was pressed tightly against his pale face, but the Reaper seemed unwilling to let go of the Cross family's bloodline. Dr. Arthur's forehead was drenched in sweat, his highly experienced hands beginning to tremble as he watched the vital signs on the screen continuously plummeting without breaking. The baby's heartbeat weakened, his breaths growing increasingly fragmented, so fragile that they seemed ready to dissolve into the void at any moment. The old doctor turned to look at Declan with eyes full of absolute helplessness, signaling that the most tragic outcome was approaching. In the corner of the room, Declan Cross, the powerful man who breathed fire, the one who had trampled upon countless lives to crown himself king of the Underworld, now could only stand rooted, his back pressed against the freezing marble wall. The hands that once threw money to bribe the entire city, that once tightly gripped life-taking guns, now hung limply. The millions of dollars in his accounts, the lucrative weapons smuggling contracts, and the army of cold-blooded assassins outside, all became piles of meaningless trash. In a moment of absolute, soul-knowing despair, the boss shockingly realized that the entire empire he had traded his youth and blood to build could not buy even a single fragile breath for his only son. From the dark, hidden corner of the room steeped in the smell of antiseptics, Clara Hayes stood frozen, her hands clad in yellow rubber gloves squeezing each other so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. The slow beeping from the heart monitor struck her eardrums like hammer blows, awakening the horrifying ghost of the past screaming in her mind. The image of the child on the medical table with purple lips and a faintly rising chest begging for thin air perfectly aligned with the silhouette of baby Noah in that torn-up trailer years ago. The dark shadow of death was once again extending its sharp claws, aiming to snatch away the life she loved, and the blood oath carved deep into her marrow suddenly flared up, incinerating all barriers of her lowly status, defying every strict rule of the marble fortress. Clara burst out of the shadows, charging straight toward the cold emergency table. A panicked nurse spread her arms to block her, shouting loudly and demanding the maid step back, but was immediately shut down by a deep, absolutely authoritative command ringing out from the wall where Declan stood leaning, telling them to let her do it. Without a hint of hesitation, Clara reached her arms through the tangled mess of medical wires, scooping up Leo's burning, limp body, pressing him tightly against her scrawny chest that was beating at a frantic pace. Holding the baby, she staggered toward the oak rocking chair placed by the window, collapsed into it, and began to rock to an invisible rhythm. The tears she had suppressed for 4 long years finally burst out, streaming profusely down her pale face, soaking the burning forehead of the child. Amidst the cold beeps of the machines, a hoarse, trembling singing voice rose. It was not a soothing lullaby, but a deeply sorrowful hymn from the distant mountain forests, carrying all the despair, the pleas, and the boundless, immense love of a mother who had once lost a child. Every shattered note blended into the tears flowing through her fingers, enveloping the tiny life. And then, like a miracle pulled from the most absurd fairy tale, Leo's rapid, wheezing breaths gradually slowed down and deepened. His skin, flushed red from the malignant fever, began to cool, giving way to the warm, rosy hue of life surging back. Within Clara's steadfast embrace, the tiny fingers that seemed to have let go forever suddenly twitched, then slowly curled up to grip tightly onto the rough fabric of her janitorial collar in an act of deep, trusting reliance. The heart monitor's sounds shifted to steady, peaceful beats. Dr. Arthur stood stunned, dropping his stethoscope, unable to believe his eyes as he witnessed a medical miracle that no expensive medicine could achieve. In the corner of the room, Declan Cross went still, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute shock before the sacred and monumental power radiating from that tiny woman, the only power in this world strong enough to snatch his son's life back from the hands of the grim Reaper. The next morning, when the pale rays of the new day had just dispelled the darkness, and the intense, suffocating tension in the nursery had completely settled, giving way to Leo's peaceful breathing, another storm quietly descended from behind the marble walls. Clara returned to the familiar, cramped space of the laundry room, her arms aching after a sleepless night, yet her heart was incredibly light because she had snatched the little life back from the hands of death. She had just bent down to gather the pure white bedsheets when the laundry room door suddenly burst open, then slammed shut ruthlessly, tightly locking away any escape route. Vivian Cross walked in, draped in an expensive suit exuding a cold arrogance, her razor-sharp eyes piercing straight into the frail, cowering silhouette of the maid, Without a word of greeting or any roundabout sarcasm as usual, the family's she-devil forcefully slammed a gray file folder onto the rotting wooden table right in front of Clara. The dry smack of the stack of papers hitting the tabletop sounded like a judge's gavel, signaling a death sentence for the fragile spark of hope that had just ignited. Vivian crossed her arms, slowly speaking in a voice that was soothing yet laced with highly toxic venom, drilling deep into the eardrums of the woman opposite her as she clearly read out every deadly piece of information meticulously recorded inside. The vicious woman dredged up the entire tragic past from the poor mountains of West Virginia, mentioning the name Noah, mentioning the cruel pneumonia, mentioning the freezing night when Clara lacked even a single penny to call an ambulance, leaving her 2-year-old biological son to freeze to death in his mother's arms. Every word Vivian spoke acted like rusty saw blades slashing at her soul, stripping bare the wound that had never healed for Clara, stabbing straight into the deepest guilt complex she had always tried to bury. Then Vivian leaned forward, grinding out every word with cold cruelty, asking what right a lowly wretch who had watched her own flesh and blood die in her arms had to demand to hold and protect her nephew. That brutal accusation completely demolished Clara's last wall of defense, making her whole body tremble violently, her legs turning to jelly, desperately clinging to the edge of the table to keep from collapsing to the floor. Her throat grew bitterly choked, unable to utter half a word in her defense, because she herself had always cursed her own being in the exact same way Vivian was now tormenting her. Not stopping at crushing the poor mother's soul, the Underworld's venomous snake continued to extend her claws, unleashing the final, fatal blow with a threat reeking of blood. She coldly forced Clara to pack her bags and get the hell out of the estate tonight, disappearing forever from the sight of Declan and Leo. Vivian warned her, using the deadly tone of Underworld law, that a lowly maid who had heard and seen far too many dark secrets of a Mafia family must immediately vanish on her own accord, otherwise the organization would have tens of thousands of bloody ways to permanently silence anyone standing in their way. The sound of Vivian's sharp heels clicked distinctly against the marble floor, then faded and vanished into the deadly silence of the hallway, leaving Clara isolated in the middle of the suffocating laundry room overflowing with the smell of chemicals. Just moments ago, her hands clad in yellow rubber gloves had clutched a tiny life so tightly, snatching the boy's breath back from the hands of death. Yet now her legs had completely lost their strength, causing her to collapse onto the rotting wooden chair next to the giant machine. Her hands covered her pale face tightly, yet not a single sob escaped, not a single teardrop fell, because the absolute agony had already drained every bleeding tear from her soul 4 years ago. The cruel, tormenting words of the family's she-devil echoed ceaselessly, spiraling deep into her eardrums, tearing away the thin scab of time that had formed over her fatal emotional wound. The thought that she had let her own child freeze to death in her arms left her wondering what right she had to demand to hold and protect the bloodline of a mob boss. That brutal truth crushed every flickering glimmer of hope, suffocating the heartbeat within her scrawny chest, making her realize that she was forever merely a jinxed sinner, a tattered shadow bearing a curse of death, never allowed to touch the light or seek out warmth. For so many years, the blood oath carved deep into her bones, promising to never let go of another child, had kept her standing, but at this moment, that very oath had morphed into a noose tightening around her neck. She understood perfectly well the brutality of the Underworld, understood the dark forces Vivian commanded, and she knew for certain that if she stubbornly stayed behind to protect Leo, the existence of a maid who knew too many secrets like her would only bring unfathomable danger to the very child she loved more than her own life. The only way to truly keep the boy absolutely safe was for her to personally sever this fragile bond, strip herself of the right to be his shield, and pack away all the trouble, fleeing from the marble fortress, swallowing the shattered despair back inside. Clara staggered to her feet, taking heavy, soulless steps back to her dark, cramped janitor's room on the ground floor. She pulled the rough, shabby, small cloth suitcase out from under the bed, looking exactly like the day she first set foot in here 6 months ago. There were not many things to pack. She merely silently folded her 2 worn-out, faded outfits and her run-down shoes inside. When her trembling hand touched the old blue blanket that had once warmed baby Noah years ago, and which was the very blanket that had saved Leo's life on that freezing winter night, her heart felt as if thousands of needles were piercing through it. She clutched that priceless keepsake tightly to her chest, breathing in the lingering warmth of the angel child one last time before carefully folding it and stuffing it deep into the bottom of the suitcase. Before the darkness of the night completely swallowed everything, Clara sat at the small table, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and an ink pen, and hurriedly wrote a few short, trembling lines expressing her gratitude for giving her a place to work, and sending a sincere apology for the trouble she had unintentionally caused. The scribbled farewell letter, bearing no signature, was gently placed by her onto the solid oak dining table in the lavish kitchen, exactly in the spot where the most powerful man in Chicago had once personally pulled out a chair for her to sit, preparing herself for a silent flight into an endless night without dawn. Dawn had just barely broken, as thick, freezing fog began to encircle the marble fortress, obscuring all visibility. Clara carried the shabby cloth suitcase, trudging silently out of the cramped room on the ground floor, but her feet unconsciously led her up the stairs to the second floor, just to stand from afar, looking through the cracked door to engrave the image of baby Leo sleeping soundly into her mind one last time before leaving forever. Yet, the moment she turned her back and stepped down the misty hallway, the towering, cold silhouette of butler Garrett Flynn stood there like a monolith, blocking every path. He crossed his arms, his lifeless face carrying its familiar disdainful stare, preparing to spew the most vicious insults on behalf of his mistress Vivian, aiming to trample on the maid's last shred of self-esteem and remind her not to harbor the delusion that the boss's soft heart would keep her safe in this underworld. But contrary to her usual frightened cowering and enduringly lowered head of the past 6 months, this time Clara suddenly stopped in her tracks and slowly raised her head high. Her crystal-clear eyes, as calm as a lake after a storm, stared straight, spiraling deep into the blood-chilling butler's eyes, carrying neither hatred nor any plead in a calm voice that carried the weight of a crashing mountain. Clara spoke up, breaking every clear-cut class boundary, questioning how she had once lost her own flesh and blood merely because of extreme poverty, had to embrace the freezing corks of her son against her chest to understand to the very core the price in blood and tears of life and death separation, so let no one dare stand here and judge that she did not belong anywhere. The words of the scrawny woman struck his eardrums like hammers, stripping bare the inhumane cruelty of those living in wealthy power, possessing an entire army of servants yet heartlessly leaving an 8-month-old life to cry desperately in a freezing room. Garrett stood stunned, his whole body turning rigid, the arms crossed over his chest instinctively loosening as those blood-soaked words directly touched the sliver of conscience that had long been buried beneath the shell of a loyal puppet. For the first time in his life, the brutal butler did not see a lowly janitor, but only saw the greatness and absolute agony of a mother. Powerfully shaken by that extraordinary inner strength, Garrett silently took a step back, making way for Clara to carry her suitcase past him, gradually fading into the misty early dawn. Once the lonely back of the woman had entirely disappeared, the butler did something rebelling against all of Vivian's cruel orders, which was to silently step up to the second floor and gently push the oak door of the nursery wide open. Instead of keeping it tightly shut as it was every night, Clara dragged her heavy feet along the freezing gravel path in the vast garden, heading straight toward the iron gates at the rear of the estate, while the dense morning fog still hung heavily over the area. She dared not turn her head back for even a single glance, for she knew very well that if her eyes accidentally caught the familiar glass window on the second floor, where the little life she cherished more than her own rested, her legs would permanently fail to take another step. At that exact moment, inside the marble fortress that had just lost its warmth, Leo suddenly jerked awake from a long night. The boy flailed his tiny hands into the empty space, desperately trying to find the familiar scent and the frail shoulders that always warned him whenever darkness fell, but the only answer was a terrifying stillness. And then the crying burst forth, not the usual whimpering, coaxing sobs demanding milk, but a hoarse, desperate, gut-wrenching scream of a child panicking intensely because he had lost his only safe world. Because the oak door had been secretly pushed wide open by the butler, that sorrowful sound was not trapped within 4 walls, but freely poured out down the endlessly long hallway, bouncing down the cold stone stairs, and echoing through every corner of the massive estate, piercing straight into the master bedroom where Declan Cross was tossing and turning in a shallow sleep. That heartbreaking cry instantly yanked the boss out of his nightmare. He snapped his eyes open, bolting up from the bed with a terrible premonition choking his heart. The nursery door was supposed to be kept closed at night, but the echoing sound was far too clear, making him realize something was wrong. Without even putting on slippers, Declan sprinted out of the room, running madly down the empty hallway, heading straight for the room emitting the frantic screams. When he entered, he saw Leo gripping the rails of his expensive Krrig tightly, pulling himself up, his tear-filled eyes darting around in confusion, searching for the silhouette of the maid wearing yellow rubber gloves in the familiar corner next to the rocking chair. Heartbroken, Declan reached out, lifting his son up to his chest, but instead of quieting down, the boy struggled violently, arching his back, forcefully pushing his father's chest away, and crying even more miserably. The 8-month-old child didn't need money, didn't need power, and certainly didn't need this cold biological father. The only thing he yearned for at this moment was the wretched mother who had held him over the brink of life and death. Helplessly clutching his continuously thrashing son, Declan dashed downstairs to the ground floor. The moment he stepped into the lavish kitchen, the boss's sharp eyes immediately collided with a folded piece of paper lying abandoned on the massive oak dining table, in the exact spot where he had once personally pulled out a chair for that woman to sit. Still holding Leo tightly with one arm, Declan grabbed the crumpled note with the other, skimming quickly over the scribbled, short lines lacking a signature, offering nothing but words of thanks and apologies for becoming a burden. The face of the most powerful man in the underworld showed no signs of his usual anger or murderous intent, but instead displayed an absolute panic mixed with agony, as if someone had just reached into his chest, scooped out the most vital soul of this house, and carried it away. Without hesitating for another second, Declan threw the farewell note aside, clutching his crying son tightly as he charged straight out the back door, stepping barefoot onto the freezing gravel in the garden, repeating exactly the image of himself on that fateful winter night, dashing through the thick fog to search for the only light that could salvage the lives of both father and son. Declan's bare feet slammed heavily onto the sharp gravel, tearing faint, bloody trails on the freezing path, but he paid no mind to that trivial pain because Leo's heartrending screams in his arms were suffocating all of the boss's senses. Through the dense morning fog, Clara's frail figure, trudging along carrying the shabby cloth suitcase, slowly appeared in the blur near the main gates. Just a few dozen steps away from the main road, that woman would completely disappear from his world. Clara, Declan's hoarse voice rang out, tearing through the fog, carrying a choked-up pleading that the entire Chicago underworld had never once heard before. It was not a cold, fire-breathing command from a man standing above 10,000 others, but the desperate sob of a man begging the only person who could save his family's soul. Clara froze, her numb legs glued to the ground, but she absolutely dared not turn her head back. The hand carrying her suitcase clenched so tight her knuckles turned white, her frail shoulders trembling violently beneath the thin janitorial uniform. "That I don't want to bring any more trouble to you. Sir, please let me leave in peace," she spoke in a broken, fractured voice, her eyes shut tight to stop the tears of humiliation from falling. But the exact moment that familiar sound rang out, the 8-month-old child struggling madly against Declan's chest instantly changed his demeanor. The frantic screams born of fear suddenly shifted into choked, utterly pitiful sobs. Leo reached his two tiny arms out, grasping at the air, aiming straight for the trembling back of the woman ahead, his mouth continuously making sounds begging for an embrace. The sorrowful sound of the child felt like tens of thousands of knives carving into Clara's soul, causing her entire body to turn rigid, her breath completely stifled. She knew very well that if she merely turned her head, if her eyes merely met those tiny hands waiting so desperately, all her efforts to run away to protect her oath and protect the boy himself would utterly collapse. Declan stepped closer, the crunching of gravel echoing rapidly right behind her. He did not issue an order, nor did he bother asking what cruel words Vivian had said to force her to this desperate edge. Instead, with a decisive yet incredibly tender motion, the boss reached his arms forward, gently placing the fragile life crying so heavily into Clara's trembling embrace from behind her back. She panicked, raising her hands to support the child, driven by a fierce maternal instinct deeply rooted in her bones. The moment the warmth from her scrawny chest transferred to him, Leo instantly stopped crying, gripping his tiny fingers onto her janitorial collar, burying his tear-stained face deep into the hollow of her neck, finding absolute safety. A quiet stillness enveloped the space, leaving only the sound of the child's steady, peaceful breathing. the shabby cloth suitcase slipped from Clara's hand, dropping with a thud onto the cold gravel. She stood rooted in the middle of the misty path, hugging tightly onto the flesh and blood that was not her own, yet was the only life she was willing to trade her own life to protect. Declan stood towering right behind her, his bloodshot eyes pinned onto their silhouettes. His voice rang out, warm and resolute, shattering all barriers of status, all class prejudices, and all blood-soaked rules of the underworld that weighed heavy on the suffering woman's shoulders. "You are not a maid, you are the boy's heart, and the heart of this home as well." Hearing that declaration which broke every boundary, Clara turned around, looking up with tear-filled eyes straight into the powerful man. And then she burst into sobs, her crying no longer carrying frustration, humiliation, or the agony of separation, but rather the bursting tears of a ragged, lonely wanderer who, after so many years, had finally found a place she truly belonged, a place where she was cherished and held on to with every ounce of life. That very evening, a suffocating and immensely tense atmosphere enveloped the lavish main dining room of the marble estate, beneath the brilliant yellow light from the giant crystal chandelier. The long table, draped in pure white silk, was set with silver cutlery and expensive crystal glasses, but absolutely no one was in a mood to enjoy anything, for this was certainly not a warm family dinner. In the underworld steeped in the stench of blood of the Cross family, whenever the boss personally summoned an emergency meeting right at the main dining table, it meant power was about to be stripped away, or a death sentence was about to be passed. Sitting at the far end of the long table were 3 high-ranking lieutenants representing the 3 largest factions protecting the organization's smuggling and money laundering network, every face coldly ruthless, quietly observing the situation. Huddled in a dark corner was Butler Garrett Flynn, his face pale and forehead glistening with sweat after witnessing what unfolded at the gates that morning. Sitting proudly right in the center, to the right of the head seat, was Declan Cross, draped in an elegant black dress, leisurely swirling red wine in her glass with a radiant, arrogant half-smile. The vicious woman was certain that the thorn in her eye had been pulled out by its roots, convinced that the lowly maid named Clara Hayes had disappeared forever from Chicago along with her shabby suitcase, precisely according to the perfect script she had heartlessly orchestrated. However, Vivian's triumphant smile instantly froze on her lips as the massive oak doors of the dining room suddenly swung wide open. Every eye in the room simultaneously locked onto the door, and everyone was stunned to the point of holding their breath upon seeing Clara slowly walk in. She was neither running away, nor trembling with her head bowed like a sinner carrying the burden of her class, but rather held her head high, taking steady, firm strides. She still wore her familiar, faded janitorial uniform, but her demeanor exuded a chillingly resilient calmness. Ignoring all the sharp, mocking stares and the sheer horror of the underworld underlings, Clara walked straight up to the most powerful dining table, pulled out the empty chair right next to Declan's head seat, and calmly sat down. Vivian's face instantly turned as white as a corpse, the hand holding the wine glass trembling so violently that drops of deep red wine sloshed out, staining the pure white tablecloth. The 3 underworld lieutenants exchanged bewildered looks, for in the history of the organization, never had a hired worker dared to sit as an equal alongside those in power. Declan Cross stepped in slowly right behind Clara, the boss's face as cold as a floating iceberg. He did not sit down, but stood towering at the head of the table, resting his hands on the marble surface, casting a razor-sharp gaze that swept across every terrified face in the room. A deadly silence dragged on for tens of seconds, feeling seemingly endless, before the deep, husky voice carrying the absolute authority of the underworld king rang out, tearing through the thick atmosphere. Declan ground out every word, clearly and distinctly recounting the terrifying night when his son nearly lost his life due to a malignant fever and the apathy of those who shared his bloodline. He cast a look toward Clara, affirming before the entire organization that the life of the family heir was preserved not by wealth or power, but by the noble sacrifice of this woman wearing a janitor's uniform. Then Declan took a deep breath, loudly proclaiming a shocking truth that shattered every blood-soaked rule of survival the Cross family had worshipped for over 20 years. He recalled the harsh teachings of his late father before his death, that love was a fatal weakness that would turn into the bullet ending a boss, but at this very moment, with all his determination and a healed heart, Declan loudly affirmed in front of the most prominent men in Chicago that his father had been entirely wrong. As soon as Declan's resounding declaration concluded, The atmosphere in the dining room froze like a suffocating block of ice as he slowly advanced toward the violently trembling Vivian. The boss's eyes held no shred of familial warmth, leaving only a chilling punishment for the one who had dared use the ghosts of the past to drive away the savior of his son. Vivian tried to open her mouth to justify herself with her usual fake, soft voice, but was immediately silenced by Declan's thunderous slam on the table, which made the crystal glasses bounce and shatter to pieces. He coldly exposed every despicable scheme she had orchestrated, from forcing Clara into humiliating janitorial work, to using the death of baby Noah to stab the poor woman's heart in the middle of a freezing winter night. Declan ground out his words, declaring that a family that only worshipped cruelty and cold-blooded rules would sooner or later destroy itself from within, and he would not let Leo grow up in a hell devoid of humanity like that. Before the eyes of the three high-ranking lieutenants and butler Garrett Flynn, the boss decisively stripped Vivian of all financial management privileges and her right to interfere in internal family affairs, simultaneously ordering her immediate expulsion from the Marble Estate to an isolated island in the south, forever forbidden from stepping foot back in Chicago. Vivian screamed in despair as she was dragged away by two muscular bodyguards, hauled out of the dining room, leaving behind a solemn, deeply respectful silence from the subordinates who had always feared her tyranny. At this point, Declan slowly turned toward Clara, who still sat quietly, her eyes brimming with tears, yet holding a peace she had never known. He tenderly held her rough hands that still carried the scent of laundry soap, slowly peeling off the yellow rubber gloves, the symbol of her lowly status all this time, and tossed them into the wreckage of shattered glass on the floor. In the middle of the brightly lit room, Declan slightly bowed his head, placing a kiss of reverence on the calluses of Clara's hands, proudly declaring before the entire Cross Empire that from this moment on, no one was allowed to call her a maid or a janitor, for she was the sole lady of this fortress and the rightful mother of the future heir. Clara looked into the bloodshot yet intensely protective eyes of the most powerful man in the underworld. She then offered a slight smile through tears of happiness, realizing that after so many storms in life and the heaven-piercing pain of losing a child, she had finally found a true sanctuary, where love and sacrifice were placed far above any blood-soaked crown. A new chapter brimming with hope opened for the Cross family as Leo's cries from upstairs suddenly faded, replaced by echoing, bright laughter signaling the rebirth of a complete family right in the heart of Chicago, a city rife with dart traps. The fall of Vivian Cross was like a rolling thunderclap striking the very roots of the long-standing criminal empire, leaving the entire city of Chicago trembling in utter astonishment over the boss Declan's insane decision regarding a maid. However, inside the marble fortress, it was no longer the suffocating atmosphere of dark schemes, but rather a deeply dignified stillness as Clara Hayes officially stepped into the role of the lady of the house, bearing a surprisingly humble yet resilient demeanor. She did not drape herself in expensive silk dresses or wear sparkling diamond necklaces to flaunt herself the way Vivian once did, but retained her rustic charm, with a gentle smile constantly on her lips whenever she comforted baby Leo. Her presence transformed the cold hallways into a genuine home, where the laughter of the 8-month-old child echoed all day long, washing away the mourning ghosts of the past. Declan too gradually shed his iron-hard, ruthless exterior every time he returned home, no longer a notorious boss but simply a man longing for family warmth, ready to sit for hours on end just to watch Clara teach Leo his very first babbling words by the sun-drenched window. Butler Garrett Flynn now served with a truly genuine, intrinsic respect, not out of fear for Declan's authority, but because he had truly been conquered by the forgiving heart of the woman he had once despised as a lowly janitor. On a late afternoon when the sunset painted the whole horizon red, Clara held Leo's hand as he took his first wobbly steps on the lush green grass of the garden, the very place where just a few months ago she was silently sweeping leaves in humiliation. Declan approached from behind, wrapping his arms tightly around the two most precious lives in his world, and softly whispered into her ear a promise of a bright future devoid of blood and tears. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the peaceful rhythm of his heartbeat, knowing that no matter how crazy the world out there might be, within these arms, she and Leo had truly found destiny's final harbor. The story of the suffering mother who lost her son in the mountains of West Virginia years ago now closed with a new, blissful chapter, where love and noble sacrifice conquered all class barriers to write a soul-stirring legend right in the heart of Chicago, a city rife with dark traps. Congratulations on finishing this deeply emotional journey of the Cross family and the resilient mother Clara Hayes with me. Closing the stormy journey of the Cross family and the resilient mother Clara Hayes, the 20th part of the story delivers a profound stillness, akin to a lake's surface after destiny's fiercest storm. As the brilliant sunset descends upon the marble estate in Chicago, the image of Clara holding baby Leo's hand as he takes tentative steps on the lush green grass is not just a symbol of rebirth, but a powerful testament to the boundless strength of sacred maternal love. This story has left us with an immensely precious life lesson. The true value of a person does not lie in titles, wealth, or dark power, but rather in decency and compassion between human beings. The most profound human value is genuine love, capable of redeeming even the hardest of hearts and erasing all harsh class divisions in modern society. Through Clara's life, we see that no matter how painful the past may be, or how deeply fate may bury us in the dark mud of humiliation, as long as we maintain our faith and kindness, we can still find the light of salvation for ourselves and those around us. How do you, our audience, feel about this story? Do you see reflections of extraordinary efforts in your own actual lives? We eagerly look forward to hearing the sincere thoughts and feelings from deep within your hearts through the comments section below this video, so we can spread positive life values together. If you love this content, we cordially invite you to subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share so you do not miss the captivating and meaningful stories updated every day. Your support is an immense motivation for us to continue creating and contributing. Lastly, we wish all the viewers tuning into this video abundant health, a life overflowing with joy and peace and optimism in your souls every single day. Thank you sincerely for watching. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.